Introducing YouTube memberships, a fun way to support the channel while getting some exclusive perks. Click the join button to become a member now and get benefits like badges next to your name on videos, behind-the-scenes photos, advantages during the live trivia game, discounts on merchandise, private one-on-one video chats, the ability to request future video topics, and exclusive 8 to 10 minute videos on the history of the NFL. And now, on with our feature presentation. To start off, let's talk about the movie Saving Private Ryan. The Steven Spielberg film that came out in 1998 is widely regarded as one of the greatest war movies ever made, and one of the greatest films ever made, period, with the first 20 minutes of the movie still living on in history as some of the greatest work of cinema ever put onto the big screen. The movie ended up being nominated for 11 Academy Awards, winning 5 of them, including Best Directing, which was won by Spielberg. And one of Spielberg's absolutely genius decisions during the movie was to send all of the actors through a week-long boot camp before filming so that they could get an idea of what life was really like. That was everyone except for Matt Damon. While every other actor participated in this boot camp, being in the trenches and suffering through intense workouts and whatnot, Damon was not there. He was given special treatment to not go through boot camp. This was entirely by design. Spielberg didn't want Damon there because a big part of the movie was that the other members of the squad resented Damon's character. Instead of the actors hating Damon as part of their job, they legitimately resented Damon because they were all part of the same team, and yet didn't have to go through the same experience. Said Damon, "They started to harbor that kernel of resentment because I wasn't there. These guys are lying face down in the mud, and I'm, in a bubble bath in America. When I showed up on set, a lot of that resentment just translated right onto the screen." Safe to say, Spielberg's decision worked wonders. And while this story about Saving Private Ryan is pretty well known and has nothing to do with football, in many ways, it sort of has everything to do with football, especially training camp. This man is Minnesota Vikings head coach Bud Grant, and I've talked at length about him and his genius and some of the craziest stories of his legendary career. So if you want to learn more about one of them, you can do so by clicking the card in the upper right corner. Grant understood the feeling of resentment that players might have toward each other when one of them does not have to suffer or go through the same experiences, much like Steven Spielberg and Matt Damon. Imagine that you're busting your butt in training camp, going through the two-a-days, living in the dorms, living on the edge, and being in immense pain every day as you get ready for the season. And then, a guy just shows up and doesn't have to do any of that. Oh, and by the way, he's making more money than you. Well, this is where the genius of Bud Grant comes into play. Because in 1980, with the team's first-round pick, defensive end Doug Martin, instead of allowing that resentment to fester on and create a divide in the team, Grant did something absolutely genius that made this a complete non-problem and brought the Vikings closer together as a team in the process. Because this is the story behind one of the greatest coaching moments of Bud Grant's career that you might not know about. Before I talk about what exactly Grant did, we need some context to understand this player right here, as in, the player in question that this impacted, and why he missed training camp in the first place. In 1979, the Minnesota Vikings had a surprisingly disappointing season. After winning the NFC Central 7 straight seasons, not only did they come in third place, but they did so with a losing record, finishing the year at 7-9. It was just the second time since Bud Grant became a head coach in the NFL, and the first time since his very first season in 1967 that the Vikings finished the year with a losing record. And it was just the third time since he took over that they missed the playoffs. Once a dominant and consistent force in the league, the Vikings were, for the first time in what felt like forever, a below-average football team, and a team that ended the season losing 6 of its final 10 games to give themselves no shot at the playoffs by the time December rolled around. As a side note, to learn more about one of those losses they suffered in 1979, click the card in the upper right corner. And a big reason for their struggles in 1979 was their lack of a pass rush. The Purple People Eaters were no more, as the once dominant Vikings defense was 17th in the league out of 28 teams in points scored, finishing in the bottom half of the league in that category. A lot of it had to do with a surprisingly anemic pass rush that across the 16-game season only mustered up 30 sacks, coming out to less than 2 sacks a game. Out of 28 teams in the league, this ranked just 22nd, and considering the fact that the league-wide average was 38 sacks, the Vikings were well below that number. It also didn't help that just 2 players on the team were able to pick up more than 4 sacks, and no one on the team mustered up more than 8, meaning that the number 1 option on the Vikings in sacks was tied for 27th in the league in that category. Multiple teams, including the New Orleans Saints, New England Patriots, and Los Angeles Rams, had multiple players with more sacks than the top man had on the Vikings. If the Vikings were going to improve in 1980 and reclaim their NFC Central title that was theirs throughout the 1970s, then they were going to need to find a way to improve their pass rush and build up their defensive line. Which is why with the 9th pick in the 1980 NFL Draft, they chose the man that you've been watching this whole time. None other than Washington defensive end Doug Martin. No, he has no relation to the Tampa Bay Buccaneers running back of the same name, although he did know what it took to play in the NFL, seeing as his brother was New York Giants defensive end George Martin, and he finished his career playing 14 seasons in the league with 96 sacks and a Super Bowl title. Even though this made Martin the 4th man in the last 6 years on the defensive line that the Vikings spent a first-round pick on, the Vikings were super high on him, even though he was coming off of a knee injury the previous year that he thought would leave him unable to ever play again. Said Grant on why he chose Martin, "We like to draft defensive linemen because it all starts at the line. That's the first line of defense." And it was clear, especially with how much the Vikings struggled on the defensive line in 1979, and with how their previous first-round picks of the position hadn't really lived up to expectations thus far, that Martin had a chance to play in 1980 and contribute in a big way. The only problem? The Vikings didn't really get to see that during training camp. Because, as was pretty commonplace with rookies back then, in the era before the rookie wage scale, you had your typical camp holdout. When the Vikings opened up training camp, sure enough, Martin was not there. In fact, with the exception of backup quarterback John Reeves, who you can learn more about by clicking the card in the upper right corner, Martin was the only player who was not there when camp opened up. Reeves wasn't holding out. He was in rehab for drug and alcohol treatment. Martin, on the other hand, was holding out. And keep in mind, per how Bud Grant operated, the Vikings opened camp up later than every other team. So for Martin to not be there meant that something went awry in the negotiations. The negotiations were pretty ugly at the start, with general manager Mike Lynn saying that the two sides were still miles apart. Per Martin's agent, Howard Slusher, on why the negotiations were at a stalemate, if the going rate is $100,000 and I ask for $300,000, maybe Lynn can justify not signing Doug Martin. But if the going rate is $100,000 and I ask for $100,000 or $105,000 and he still doesn't sign Martin, how can he justify that? How can he get Doug Martin to sign for $750,000 less than his peers are receiving? Keep in mind that the Seahawks spent their first-round pick on defensive end Jacob Green, who was chosen right after Martin was, and he was making $1 million over a 6-year period. But the Vikings were adamant that they would not pay Martin that, and they would not pay Martin more money than established veterans on the team, because it wouldn't be fair to them, and it would mess up their payroll. Things got so bad that Martin had a job lined up at a PR firm just in case he couldn't sign with the Vikings, with his agent, Howard Slusher, saying that he was going to take that deal if he had to. The two sides went over a week without speaking, and Slusher said that the Vikings either had to make Martin the highest paid player on the team or trade him. Said Slusher, "I don't think they're interested in trading Doug." So I guess it's the old case of the immovable object and the irresistible force. Mike has an unusual way of signing players, and it has worked for him. He's a very astute businessman, and he's been able to keep the numbers down. But all we're asking for is a contract not unsimilar to maybe 20 other guys in the first round. I represented the 16th player taken, Oakland Raiders quarterback Mark Wilson, and we'd take what he got. By the end of August, Martin was still unsigned. Even though General Manager Mike Lynn went to Slusher's house, stayed at Slusher's house, and spent 13 hours talking with him, none of those talks revolved around Martin. It was just two friends getting together. Said Lynn, "We didn't spend 13 hours talking about Doug Martin. We talked about houses, real estate values, vacations, people we know, all sorts of things." The two sides were nowhere close to each other, and even though the Vikings were trying to trade him so they could just get this over with and cut their losses, they couldn't do it. Said Lynn, "There's no interest in him. It's unusual. Usually in a situation like this, you get some calls from clubs, but clubs haven't called us. Cleveland has problems on defense, and yet, when they were in here, nobody asked about Martin. I guess other clubs don't want to deal with his agent, or they don't think Doug Martin wants to play, or they don't think he can play. The absence of interest shocks us." This stalemate was going into September, and it didn't look like either side was going to cave. Finally, just 3 days before the season started, and 3 days before the Vikings played their season opener against the Atlanta Falcons, when all hope was lost, a deal got done. Doug Martin, as in the man that you've been watching this whole time, was finally signed. Said Slusher about the negotiations, "I feel I have gone 15 rounds with the best, and the result was a draw. I certainly didn't defeat him, but he didn't defeat us. You appreciate a good warrior, and that is how I feel about Mike. I believe he is as good as there is in the business. I was ready to satisfy any reasonable demand that Mike made. We went through a Paragon-type negotiation. If it could have been filmed, it could be used in colleges and universities across the country to teach how to negotiate. Both sides understood what they were doing. Both sides gave and took. I did some things that I know weren't possible before. I'm sure Mike made some compromises that he didn't believe he would ever agree to. And that was nice and all, but you can't deny an unavoidable fact. Martin was one of the highest paid players on the team, despite doing absolutely nothing so far. And he skipped training camp as a result of the holdout. He didn't have to get into football shape. He didn't have to suffer like the rest of the players. He didn't have to go through the two-a-days, the early mornings, the late nights, the curfews, the drills, and all of the trials and tribulations that come with training camp, especially as a rookie. And now, he just gets to join the team with his insanely high salary and work his way into the starting lineup? You can understand how some players may have felt resentment toward it. It's the Saving Private Ryan situation. It's almost like if you're in school and you decide to form a study group where each of you would create an outline for a specific chapter or subject, and then another person joins the study group after you're done with all the outlines. Like, you can understand how you might feel resentment toward that person, seeing as they didn't have to do the hard stuff. And head coach Bud Grant, being the genius that he was, and knowing all about team psychology, understood this. On one hand, he knew that Doug Martin was going to be important for this team to win. To bench him would be foolish, especially since he wasn't even under contract. So you can't exactly punish a player for sitting out when he was never technically a part of this team in the first place. Plus, that wasn't in Bud Grant's style. He rarely suspended or disciplined players, as the only time he ever did this was in 1983, in a situation that you can learn more about by clicking the card in the upper right corner. And on top of that, the NFLPA would be all up in arms, and understandably so. The Vikings needed Martin, and Grant knew that. But on the other hand, teammates might, understandably, feel resentment toward him, especially considering his high salary without having to do anything, and especially considering the fact that he did not spend a single day in training camp. How the heck do you balance that? How do you not tick off Martin while not ticking off the rest of the team, and at the same time, boost team morale when it could very easily be an us-against-them situation? Which is why Bud Grant did something absolutely genius. When Martin got there for the team's first practice after signing, Grant had him do grass drills by himself, otherwise known as up-downs. While Martin was off doing those drills by himself, Grant spoke with the rest of the team at midfield and told them about the situation. Grant basically said, look, I know you guys might feel some resentment toward Martin, and I completely understand, but he's a part of this team, and he's going to help us a lot. But I don't want you to bottle up that resentment, because that's not healthy. I want you to let it all out. And so, Grant allowed the players to do whatever they wanted. While Martin was doing the drill and getting himself gassed, Grant allowed the players to yell, quite literally, anything they wanted to at Martin. Everything was fair game. If you had something negative to say or wanted to make fun of him, let it all out. This is a safe space. I'm going to give you these 5 minutes during the drill to do whatever the heck you want. Whatever you need to do, whatever you're feeling, do it during this time. Let all your anger out. And then after that, Martin's on the team, he's one of you guys, and we can move past this and make it water under the bridge. And so, the players did just that. Said rookie linebacker Dennis Johnson, "These are for all the days you missed." Another player said during the drill, "This is for all that money and no curfews." Safety Tommy Hannon said, "In a minute, he'll be spent." With running back Brett McClanahan yelling to Coach Grant, "You got him tired. His arm's getting tired." Even Grant got in on the action, smiling and saying, "Nobody can last forever." By the end of the drill, the players were just laughing. There was no resentment anymore. The problem was solved. Any issues they had were now gone. The players let it all out, and eventually, when they let it all out and had nothing left to let out anymore, it was all just jokes and friendly ribs. Sometimes, yelling and voicing your frustrations or writing them down can be a great way to let the anger out, and Bud Grant knew that and executed that to perfection. Just like that, what seemed like a brutal problem that could fester on for the entire season was quashed. And as you might have been able to tell from these highlights, thank goodness for that, because Martin turned out to be an excellent pick for the Vikings, bolstering their defensive line in a big way. Martin played 10 sacks with the team and not only recorded 61.5 sacks, but led the league in 1982 with 11.5 sacks, being a big reason why the Vikings made the playoffs that year. Remember that in 1982, it was a strike-shortened season, where only 9 games were played, so Martin was averaging more than a sack per game that year. He followed that up in 1983 with a career-high 13 sacks, and he had a few other seasons where he recorded 9 sacks. He was a very consistent player for the entire decade. By the time his career in Minnesota was done, his 61.5 sacks was the 4th most in franchise history, only behind Carl Eller, a Hall of Famer, Jim Marshall, a man who absolutely should be in the Hall of Fame, and Alan Page, a Hall of Famer. Not bad company if I do say so myself. And today, his sack total still ranks inside the top 10 in team history, ranking 9th. Seeing as the next closest active player on the Vikings is Harrison Smith, who has 16.5 sacks as of this video, is a safety, and is 34 years old, yeah, I don't think he's leaving that number 9 spot, let alone the top 10, anytime soon. I should note that Doug Martin had many highlights with the Vikings, a 4-sack game against the Green Bay Packers, a safety in a playoff game in 1980 in the divisional round against the Philadelphia Eagles, an interception in 1982 against the Detroit Lions. But one of his biggest highlights came in 1985 during the season opener when this team right here behind me, the Minnesota Vikings, stunned the defending Super Bowl champion San Francisco 49ers and won that game thanks to a very late fumble return by Doug Martin. I talked about that game in a previous video of mine when I had the chance to collaborate with the great Channel Purple Insider. We spoke about that game, so if you want to learn more about that game and how exactly Doug Martin and Bud Grant did during that, I'll leave a link in the description below. You can also click the card in the upper right corner. This was the genius of Bud Grant. This was his psychology in action. He understood that a situation like this could be absolutely detrimental for team chemistry. He understood that a situation like this could harbor a ton of resentment toward Martin. And he nipped it in the bud, not by ignoring it, or not by telling the players to just suck it up, but by letting the players voice their frustrations, by letting the players get everything out in a safe environment, and by understanding the concerns of the players. When people talk about Bud Grant and why he was such a great head coach and was such a great mind, this is what they mean, even if they might not be referring specifically to this story. Because Bud Grant's handling of the Doug Martin situation in 1980 with his team was just another reason, in the long list of them, why Bud Grant was so good at what he did. Get your official Jaguar Gator 9 merchandise by going to jj9shop.com, and be sure to like and subscribe, as it really helps the channel out a lot. Join me every Wednesday night where we'll play NFL Trivia for cash prizes at 9 p.m. Eastern over on Twitch. To learn more about the history of college football, subscribe to Jaguar Gator 8. To learn more about the history of Major League Baseball, subscribe to Jaguar Gator 7. Also, special thanks to all of our Patreon supporters for helping out the channel. Your support is greatly appreciated. See how you can become a patron and request future video topics in the description below.